So, you want a tarantula. Hello, tarantula lovers. I'm Alex, and you're watching Tarantula Haven. Before I get started, I'd like to give a couple of shout outs to a couple of my subscribers. The first one is Alexander Dawson from the Tarantula community on Facebook. And the other one is a person by the name of Ada Serpentine. And she actually contacted me and sent me a picture of an enclosure that she made based on the lantern enclosure that I made a video of a few episodes back, and her enclosure turned out really well. She's got a pink toe in there, which is really cool, and I love what she did with the light. She used one of those little push LED lights that you can stick anywhere, and I had that idea, but I didn't think it would fit in the top of the lantern, but she made it work, and it looked really good. So here's your shout out. So you want a tarantula. Now, I'm talking to the first time buyer, the person who's never owned a tarantula but wants to get one, or at least wants to get started in the hobby, but really doesn't know a whole lot of information about them or what to expect. So I've created a list of questions that you should ask yourself before you actually go out and purchase yourself a tarantula. Question one, why do you want a tarantula? If you want a pet that you can hold and cuddle and show off to your friends, then a tarantula might not be for you. We have a tendency to want to romanticize what we see on TV or what we see on YouTube or even in the movies. If you see your favorite YouTube star holding different species of tarantula and showing them off to the world, oftentimes you think to yourself, I'd like to have a pet that I can do that with as well. What we don't see is what can often deter you from making the decision to jump headlong into a pet that you might later on discover it wasn't exactly what you wanted, or it's nothing like what you saw on the TV or the video or in a movie. Here's the ugly truth. Tarantulas want nothing to do with you. They are, for the most part, gentle, industrious creatures that are very interesting to observe. However, if disturbed, they can be very nasty and threatening in order to defend themselves from a possible predator. That's you. Tarantulas should be treated pretty much like a fish in an aquarium. They're great to observe and take care of, but handling's not recommended. Yes, you can get gentle, docile species who can be held and for the most part won't behave defensively if you wish to pick them up, but keep in mind that even the most docile of tarantulas can have a bad mood and give a threat posture if it doesn't want to be disturbed. Also, keep in mind that handling can stress a tarantula, so should be done at a minimum for short periods of time. Does this mean that you should not handle? No, there are many people who handle their tarantulas all the time. Just keep in mind that handling provides no benefit to the tarantula and increases the potential for an accident. Also, there are species that are extremely defensive and possess medically significant venom and should not be handled at all. Some people handle these types of tarantulas as well, but just keep in mind you do so at your own risk. If, after hearing all this, you still want a tarantula, then a tarantula might be for you. Question 2. Are you squeamish? If you're interested in getting a tarantula, then obviously I'm not talking about the tarantula, but tarantulas gotta eat. Crickets, mealworms and superworms, and roaches are among some of the more popular foods to feed your tarantula. If you only have one tarantula or maybe 2 or 3, then feeding's easy. You just go buy the food in small quantities and feed as needed. But if the addiction sets in like with me, you may find yourself having to breed some of these creatures in order to have enough food available to feed all your tarantulas. So that leads to question number 3. What type of tarantula do you want? New World? Old World? Terrestrial? Fossorial? Arboreal? Or something in between? If you don't know the answer to this question, then you might want to do a little bit more research before you impulse buy a tarantula and end up with something you don't want, or worse, something you can't handle. So what is New World? New World represents any tarantula that comes from the Americas. America! No, not America. The Americas. That includes North America, Central America, and South America. Most beginners will usually start out with a New World terrestrial species. And the reason for that is because they're considered to be more docile, slower moving, and they like to stay out in the open. New World tarantulas are also considered to have milder venom, so a bite from them might be no worse than a bee sting or a wasp sting, although the mechanical bite might be a little bit worse. Most of your handleable tarantulas will usually be in the New World category. Now, New World tarantulas don't come without their drawbacks. Most terrestrial and fossorial New World tarantulas are equipped with urticating hairs. Urticating hairs are specialized hairs that are usually located on the abdomen of New World tarantulas that the tarantula usually flicks off with its hind legs and flicks into the air. And the hairs are barbed and they will stick to your skin, causing irritation, very similar to fiberglass on your skin. In some cases, these hairs can make you a little bit itchy for a few hours, but in some cases, they can actually cause severe reactions. You can develop rash or hives that can last for days. For some people, this can be a deal breaker because they can't handle the irritation of the urticating hairs. Some species rarely kick hairs, while others will kick hairs at the slightest provocation. In the same respect, some species have urticating hairs that are considered mild, while others have urticating hairs that can cause severe reactions. So it's good to know what's what. Now, I mentioned terrestrial earlier. If you don't know what that means, terrestrial means that it lives on the surface of the ground. Most of these species will usually make a small burrow underneath a log or a rock. It's usually a shallow burrow, but for the most part, they like to stay out in the open. Fossorial means that it likes to live underground. There are some species that prefer to live most of their lives underground, rarely coming out, or you may see their front legs sticking out of their burrow, but for the most part, you will hardly ever see them. This is what is known in the hobby as a pet hole. So, for those of you that can't handle the urticating hairs of the New World terrestrials, there are New World arboreal tarantulas out there. Now, arboreal means that they like to live in trees or high places, and like their terrestrial cousins, many of the New World arboreal tend to have mild venom as well. But there are some that have relatively strong venom. By strong venom, I mean that it can cause intense pain, some muscle cramping, but it's not anything that's going to kill you, and the symptoms will usually subside within a few hours and sometimes days. There are quite a few New World arboreals that can be considered docile, but there are also a lot of species in the New World arboreals that can be quite skittish and defensive and are usually considered more appropriate for intermediate hobbyists. Unlike their terrestrial counterparts, New World arboreals can be very fast and they can jump. Also, many of them don't have the urticating hairs that the terrestrials do, so that increases their likelihood that they would bite as a defense. There are some that do possess urticating hairs, but the delivery is different. Most of them will have a tendency to want to rub them on you rather than flick. So you actually have to be handling the tarantula in order to get the urticating hairs on you. So now let's talk about Old World. Old World tarantulas are anything that come from anywhere else in the world other than the Americas. Old World tarantulas are not usually recommended for beginners. Old World tarantulas tend to be very fast. They also possess very potent venom, and they're more than willing to use it defensively. They also don't possess any urticating hairs, so their main defenses are to run or bite. This is not to say that an Old World tarantula cannot make a good beginner tarantula. You just have to know exactly what you're getting into. After all, everybody who's gotten into Old World had to start somewhere. It's always a learning experience with dealing with these species. You literally have to train yourself to deal with them safely for you and your tarantula. With practice and experience, dealing with an Old World tarantula can be just as easy and stress-free as dealing with a New World. However, Old World species have to be treated with respect at all times. Many of them possess what is considered medically significant venom. Just like with New World, a bite from these species is not going to kill you, but the symptoms can be a whole lot more severe. You can end up with intense pain, swelling, muscle cramping, nausea, vomiting, shortness of breath, even heart palpitations, and in some cases the symptoms can last for weeks. A bite from these tarantulas can end up in a trip to the emergency room. And just like with New World, they come in all shapes and sizes: terrestrial, fossorial, and arboreal. So, question number 4. The next thing you want to consider is housing. What are you going to keep your tarantula in when you get it? Fortunately, tarantulas are very forgiving as far as housing is concerned. Most people opt for a small plastic box or a clear container of some sorts, or even a dram vial for a very small sling. Cross ventilation is key when keeping tarantulas. Most people use a soldering iron or a drill of some sorts in order to make ventilation holes in their enclosures. For adult tarantulas, many people will splurge on a permanent enclosure, something like an Exoterra enclosure or a Bulgarian, or even a custom made tarantula enclosure. These can be expensive, so it's not necessary, but depending on your budget and the amount of tarantulas that you have, it could be a good investment to give your pet a nice enclosure that is attractive to display. If it's a young tarantula or a sling, it doesn't really make much sense to me to buy an expensive enclosure that's going to be temporary. But again, that all depends on your taste and your budget, how much you want to spend on an enclosure. As far as substrate is concerned, most people tend to use cocoa fiber as a staple substrate for tarantulas. As people become better acquainted with their tarantulas, they'll have a tendency to want to customize their substrate to suit their tarantula's needs, by mixing in things like soil or sand or excavator clay in order to simulate a more natural environment. So let's talk about the size of the enclosure. There's not really a good rule of thumb out there as far as what size is appropriate for what tarantula. What I usually go by is I want to give the tarantula enough room to move about the enclosure freely and still have the things inside that it needs. For example, if it's a sling, I want it to have enough room so that it can move about comfortably in the enclosure, and I want enough substrate that it can burrow if it is a terrestrial tarantula. If it's arboreal, then I want to have a taller enclosure that it can climb freely and feel comfortable inside. With an arboreal, you don't need as much substrate, but you do want to have enough in there that it can retain moisture when you wet it so that it can provide humidity for the enclosure. Tarantulas don't need a ton of space. They're pretty much homebodies. They spend a great deal of time conserving energy because in the wild it's kind of feast or famine for them. They have relatively slow metabolism so that they can endure long periods of time without food. They save all of their energy for short bursts of speed so they can pounce on their prey or escape from predators. For juveniles and adults, I pretty much do the same thing. I want to make sure that they have enough space that they can move about freely in the tarantula, and that I can also put in a watering dish and maybe some decorations and a hide. Arboreals are a little bit different. You don't need as much floor space on an arboreal. You want a taller enclosure so that they can climb, and you want to have enough room that you can put in a piece of cork bark or a long cork tube in there so that they can use that as a hide. And of course, put a watering dish somewhere near the bottom or even glue it to the side as some people do. As far as substrate is concerned, they also don't need as much substrate. I usually put in about an inch or two of substrate in there, enough so that they can retain some moisture in there if you wet it. And they have a tendency to want to make what are called web curtains, and they'll take the substrate and actually mix it with their web so that they can put it around their hide and have some privacy. Finally, question number 5. Are you willing to do research about your tarantula? I can't stress this enough. Do your homework, do your homework, do your homework. Know what you're getting into. If you know what species of tarantula you are getting or you're interested in, do as much research as you can so that you can maximize your chances of success in caring for that tarantula. Even if you impulse buy a tarantula, you can still go back and do as much research as you can about that species so that you can effectively care for it. There's no excuse for you not doing the research. There's just too much information out there for you not to. There's Facebook groups and forums like the Arachno boards and lots of YouTube channels that are great resources. Most people are willing to help out new hobbyists, and they'll probably provide you with more information that you would ever want to know about your tarantula. My go-to guy on YouTube is Tom Moran of Tom's Big Spiders. I know you've heard me mention him before on some of my videos. I just happen to like his style and I like how informative he is. But there are others that I watch, like Eerie Arachnids and Tarantula Dan, John 3800. Those are all very informative channels, but there's lots and lots more out there that can help you out. And again, a lot of them are willing to answer any questions and give you information about how to keep your tarantula. You'll find that most tarantulas are actually easy to keep and their care is very similar, but there are exceptions. There's some tarantulas that have higher humidity requirements, and there's others that like it bone dry. And there's some tarantulas that have just little idiosyncrasies that are good to know. I mention this because I've been guilty of not doing my homework myself. It happened when I had bought a couple of green bottle blue tarantulas at a reptile show, and they came in little deli containers with moist substrate. Now, I know that adult green bottle blue tarantulas like conditions dry. Well, I made the mistake of assuming that spiderlings needed moist conditions because that's generally how you keep most spiderlings. But boy, was I wrong. It wasn't until one died that I quickly went and did my research and found out that green bottle blue spiderlings like conditions dry, just like their parents. So I learned my lesson. I quickly changed out the substrate on the one remaining one that I had and saved its life. It survived, and fortunately for me, it turned out to be a female and it's doing very well. But it was a very hard lesson learned. It hurt not only because I had killed the tarantula because of my negligence, but I also lost $50, which is how much it cost me. I might as well have taken that $50 and just thrown it out in the wind. So, do your homework so you don't end up wasting your money just like I did. So that's 5 things to consider if you're wanting to get into tarantula. And that wraps up my video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give me a like. If you want to see more, subscribe. If you want to support this channel, I do have a Redbubble store where I sell Tarantula Haven merchandise. I'll post a link to that in the description below. Any of the proceeds that come from the Redbubble store will go directly to help support and grow this channel. Until next time, keep loving them tarantulas.